8 teeth sat quietly in a storage drawer in Poland for over a decade, waiting for a question nobody had thought to ask them. They belonged to creatures most people picture as solitary, dim-witted cave dwellers, wandering alone through an ice age wilderness. But when scientists finally extracted the genetic material hidden inside the ancient enamel, what came back was not isolation. It was a family, a mother, her children, sitting together in the dark for 100,000 years, waiting for technology advanced enough to finally hear what their bones had been saying the entire time. And what they revealed is now forcing an entire field of science to rewrite what it thought it understood about who these people actually were. For most of the 20th century, the popular image of a Neanderthal looked something like this: a hunched, brutish figure trudging alone across a frozen landscape, grunting at shadows, barely capable of complex thought, destined to lose an evolutionary contest against smarter, more social modern humans. That image took hold decades ago and proved remarkably stubborn, repeated in textbooks, museum dioramas, and popular culture long after scientists themselves had started gathering evidence pointing in a completely different direction. The problem was never a lack of curiosity. The problem was a lack of material. Neanderthal genetic data has, for decades, suffered from a specific and frustrating limitation. Fossils turn up scattered, isolated, separated by vast stretches of geography and centuries of time, leaving researchers to piece together fragments of a much larger story from disconnected clues scattered across an entire continent. You find one tooth in Spain, you find a jawbone in Croatia, you find a fragment of skull in Siberia. Each discovery adds a single data point to an enormous, mostly empty map, and connecting those scattered dots into anything resembling a coherent picture of how these people actually lived together has remained one of the hardest problems in the entire field. That is precisely what makes a small limestone cavern in southern Poland so important right now, because it finally broke that pattern. Stajnia Cave sits at an elevation of roughly 360 meters, tucked into the Kraków-Częstochowa upland between two small villages, accessible only through a narrow entrance carved into the rock over thousands of years of slow geological erosion. Archaeological teams first excavated the site systematically between 2007 and 2010, carefully working through a relatively small area at the rear of the cave, and among the most significant discoveries pulled from that ground were 9 ancient human teeth, several of which were identified at the time as belonging to Neanderthals. For years afterward, those teeth sat preserved, studied to the extent the technology of the time allowed, but holding a secret nobody yet had the tools to fully unlock. That changed when an international team of researchers, led by scientists at the University of Bologna and working alongside specialists from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and several Polish research institutions, decided to take a fresh run at those Stajnia teeth, using techniques in ancient DNA extraction that simply did not exist when the original excavation took place. Their target was mitochondrial DNA, a specific category of genetic material that behaves very differently from the genetic information most people are familiar with. Unlike the DNA you inherit from both of your parents in roughly equal measure, mitochondrial DNA passes down exclusively through the maternal line, mother to child, generation after generation, essentially unchanged except for slow, predictable mutations accumulating over enormous stretches of time. That specific property is exactly what made this particular research approach so powerful, because it allowed scientists to trace direct maternal relationships across individuals who died tens of thousands of years apart, in a way that ordinary fossil analysis never could. Working carefully with 8 of the original teeth recovered from Stajnia Cave, the research team successfully extracted usable ancient mitochondrial genomes, and what emerged from that analysis represented something genuinely unprecedented in the entire history of Neanderthal genetic research. The results, published in the scientific journal Current Biology in April of 2026, demonstrated that at least 7 of these individuals belonged to the same population and almost certainly lived during the exact same general time period. Think about what that actually means, because it is easy to read past a sentence like that without absorbing its real significance. This was not 7 scattered, unrelated fossils that happened to wash up in roughly the same geographic region across different eras. This was a coherent population. A group of people who, by every reasonable interpretation of the genetic evidence, knew each other, lived alongside each other, and shared a community together inside that specific cave at that specific moment in deep prehistory. The lead researcher on the project, a professor at the University of Bologna, described the discovery in terms that convey exactly how rare an opportunity this actually represents. According to his own account, this result is extraordinary precisely because, for the first time, researchers were able to observe a small group of at least 7 Neanderthals from Central Eastern Europe who lived around 100,000 years ago, all from a single coherent location and time period, rather than the usual scattered fragments collected from sites separated by hundreds of miles and tens of thousands of years. He emphasized that in most previous cases, Neanderthal genetic data has come from single isolated fossils, or from remains scattered across entirely different sites and entirely different periods of prehistory, making any kind of coherent social picture nearly impossible to assemble. Stajnia Cave broke that pattern decisively, offering something researchers in this field rarely ever get to study directly: an actual community, frozen together in the genetic record, rather than disconnected individuals separated by an unbridgeable gulf of time and distance. By carefully analyzing subtle patterns within the recovered genetic material, the research team was able to estimate that these individuals lived during a specific warm climatic period, stretching from roughly 120,000 years ago to approximately 92,500 years ago. That places this discovery as the oldest known group of multiple Neanderthals ever identified through direct genetic evidence anywhere in Central Europe. A genuinely significant milestone for a field that has spent decades working primarily with isolated, disconnected fragments. And this is precisely where the story stops, being simply an impressive technical achievement, and starts becoming something far more personal, far more human, in a way that should genuinely catch you off guard, given who we are actually talking about. Among the 8 teeth analyzed, researchers discovered something that none of them had specifically been searching for when the project began. 3 of those teeth, 2 belonging to clearly juvenile individuals and 1 belonging to an adult, carried completely identical mitochondrial DNA. Read that again, because the implication sitting inside that single sentence is genuinely remarkable. Since mitochondrial DNA passes down exclusively through the maternal line, an identical genetic match between an adult and 2 children almost certainly means these 3 individuals shared the same mother, or were otherwise extremely closely related through a direct maternal bloodline. A researcher from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology who co-authored the study described this specific finding as a particularly fascinating aspect of the entire project, explaining that the genetic match strongly suggests these individuals were closely related to one another, likely a mother alongside her own children. Sit with that image for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. 100,000 years before any human being would write a single word, before agriculture, before cities, before almost everything we associate with the dawn of civilization, an adult Neanderthal woman lived inside this specific cave alongside what appears to be her own children. They existed together as an actual family unit, hunting and surviving, and presumably caring for one another through harsh seasons in a landscape that offered no margin for error and no guarantee of survival. And then, 100,000 years later, through nothing more than careful chemistry applied to 3 small fragments of preserved enamel, modern science reached back across that unimaginable gulf of time and confirmed, with genuine scientific rigor, that this family actually existed, that their relationship to each other was real, and that the bond connecting a mother to her children survived, encoded silently inside their own teeth long after every other trace of their lives had completely disappeared from the earth. This single discovery alone would already represent a meaningful contribution to the field. But the Stajnia research extended considerably further than simply confirming one family's existence, because when researchers compared the genetic signature recovered from these Polish remains against other known Neanderthal genomes collected from across the broader region, they uncovered something that complicates the entire emerging picture in a genuinely fascinating way. The specific maternal lineage identified at Stajnia Cave turned out to match genetic signatures previously recovered from Neanderthal remains found in completely different parts of Europe and Western Asia, including sites located in the Iberian Peninsula, in southeastern France, and as far away as the northern Caucasus Mountains, regions separated from southern Poland by well over 1,000 miles of difficult, varied terrain. Think carefully about what that actually means for how we understand Neanderthal populations as a whole. This was not simply one small, isolated family group living in quiet seclusion inside a single Polish cave, disconnected from the wider world around them. The genetic evidence strongly suggests that this exact maternal lineage was, at some point roughly 100,000 years ago, distributed across an enormous swath of Western Eurasia, connecting populations separated by mountain ranges, river systems, and thousands of miles of landscape that modern humans would still find genuinely challenging to traverse on foot today. Somehow, across that staggering distance, a shared maternal genetic lineage persisted and spread, which raises a question that researchers are still actively working to answer. How exactly did Neanderthal populations maintain genetic continuity across such enormous distances, separated by such difficult terrain, using nothing but their own physical mobility and whatever social networks connected distant, scattered communities together? But here is where the story takes its most genuinely unexpected turn, the detail that pulls this entire discovery from the realm of impressive academic achievement into something approaching a genuine scientific puzzle. Researchers studying the Stajnia genetic material decided to compare their results against a separate, previously studied Neanderthal individual known informally as Thorin, whose remains were originally discovered in Mandrin Cave, located in France. Thorne had already been the subject of considerable scientific attention in his own right, and previous research had dated his remains to approximately 50,000 years ago. Here is the detail that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. When researchers compared Thorne's mitochondrial genome against the genetic signature recovered from Stagnia Cave, they discovered the two were strikingly, almost startlingly similar, belonging to essentially the same specific maternal lineage, despite Thorne's remains being dated to a period 50,000 years after the Stagnia family is believed to have lived. Read that again, because the math involved here is genuinely difficult to wrap your head around. 50,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. It represents roughly 2,500 human generations, an interval vastly longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization multiplied many times over. And yet, according to this genetic comparison, the same maternal lineage identified in a Polish cave somehow persisted, essentially unchanged at the mitochondrial level, across that entire staggering interval, eventually surfacing again in a completely different cave located hundreds of miles away in France. One of the lead researchers on the project, a professor specializing in radiocarbon dating at the University of Bologna, offered a notably cautious interpretation of this finding, emphasizing that this comparison serves as an important reminder that the oldest chronologies in this field must be treated with genuine caution. She specifically noted that when radiocarbon values approach the outer limits of what current calibration methods can reliably measure, it becomes essential not to assign more precision to the resulting dates than the underlying data can actually support. That note of caution matters enormously, and it deserves to be treated as a central part of this story rather than a minor caveat buried at the end. There are essentially two ways to interpret this strange genetic overlap between Stagnia and Thorne, and researchers themselves are not yet in a position to definitively choose between them. The first possibility is that this specific maternal lineage genuinely persisted, essentially unchanged across an almost unimaginable 50,000-year span, surviving multiple climate shifts, population movements, and generational changes, while somehow avoiding the kind of genetic drift that typically accumulates steadily over such enormous timescales. The second, perhaps more likely possibility, according to several researchers involved in this broader area of study, is that one or both of these specific dating estimates may require future revision as dating technology and methodology continue to improve, meaning the true gap separating these two individuals might ultimately prove considerably smaller than 50,000 years, once additional evidence becomes available. Either interpretation carries significant implications for the broader field. If the first explanation holds up under future scrutiny, it would suggest Neanderthal maternal lineages were dramatically more genetically stable and far more widely persistent across enormous stretches of time and geography than previous models had assumed, fundamentally reshaping how researchers think about Neanderthal population structure and migration patterns across the entirety of Western Eurasia. If the second explanation eventually proves correct instead, it would highlight just how much remains genuinely uncertain about the precision of dating methods applied to remains sitting at the very outer edge of what current radiocarbon and genetic dating techniques can reliably measure, a humbling reminder that even our most sophisticated scientific tools still carry meaningful margins of error when reaching back across geological timescales this vast. What both interpretations share, regardless of which one eventually proves correct, is a genuinely important shift in how researchers are now thinking about Neanderthal social structure more broadly. For decades, the prevailing scientific assumption treated Neanderthal populations primarily as small, scattered, loosely connected bands, moving independently across the landscape with minimal, sustained contact between distant groups. The Stagnia discovery, combined with this strange genetic echo connecting it to a site in France, pushes researchers toward a noticeably different picture, one involving structured, genetically continuous communities maintaining some form of connection, whether through direct migration, periodic contact between neighboring groups, or some combination of both, across distances and timescales considerably larger than earlier models had ever seriously considered. This broader shift in scientific thinking about Neanderthal social complexity did not emerge in isolation. It connects directly to a separate, equally significant piece of research published just a few months earlier, in which a different team of scientists proposed a genuinely compelling explanation for why Neanderthals eventually disappeared from the fossil record entirely, while modern humans continued expanding and thriving across the same landscapes. According to that research, the difference may not have come down primarily to climate pressures or direct competition for resources between the two populations, as earlier theories had often suggested. Instead, the key distinguishing factor may have been social connectivity itself, the specific ability of early modern human populations to form stronger, more flexible, more far-reaching social networks that allowed information, resources, and genetic diversity to flow more efficiently across larger, more dispersed groups of people. Hold that idea directly alongside the Stagnia discovery for a moment, because the connection between these two separate pieces of research becomes genuinely striking once you place them side by side. If Neanderthal communities, like the one preserved at Stajnia Cave, did maintain some meaningful level of connectivity across vast distances, as the genetic evidence increasingly suggests, but that connectivity nonetheless proved less extensive, less flexible, or less resilient than the social networks early modern humans were simultaneously developing across the same general time frame. That comparative difference alone could help explain why one population ultimately thrived, while the other gradually vanished entirely from the historical record. Neanderthals were not simply isolated, disconnected individuals stumbling blindly through an unforgiving landscape, as outdated popular stereotypes have long suggested. But the more nuanced, more accurate emerging picture suggests their social networks, however genuinely real and however far-reaching they may have been, may still have fallen meaningfully short of whatever specific advantage allowed modern human populations to eventually outcompete and outlast them across an evolutionary timescale spanning tens of thousands of years. There is also a deeply personal dimension to this discovery that deserves serious attention, one that extends directly into the genetic makeup of nearly everyone currently watching or reading this story. The relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans was never a simple, one-directional story of replacement, where one population straightforwardly vanished while an entirely separate population expanded to take its place. Extensive genetic research conducted over the past 2 decades has firmly established that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred directly on multiple distinct occasions, as both populations expanded across overlapping territories in Europe and Western Asia. As a direct result of that ancient interbreeding, most people of non-African descent walking around today carry a small but entirely real percentage of Neanderthal DNA embedded directly within their own genome, a quiet genetic inheritance passed down silently across hundreds of generations, completely invisible in daily life, yet permanently woven into the biological foundation of who modern humans actually are. That detail transforms a discovery like Stajnia Cave from simply an interesting academic finding into something considerably more personally resonant. The mother and her children, whose genetic relationship was just confirmed inside a Polish cave, were not some entirely separate, completely unrelated branch of life disconnected from our own species' story. They were closely related cousins on the broader human evolutionary tree, close enough that their descendants, however distantly removed across tens of thousands of years, may well have eventually contributed small fragments of genetic material that persist, quietly and invisibly, inside the genomes of people reading this story right now. The gap separating a Neanderthal family living in a Polish cave 100,000 years ago from anyone alive today is not nearly as vast or as biologically alien as popular culture has spent decades suggesting. Beyond the personal genetic connection, this discovery carries significant weight for how researchers now understand the broader geography of Neanderthal history across Europe. For decades, the most extensively studied and most thoroughly documented Neanderthal sites tended to cluster heavily in Western Europe, particularly across France, Spain, and parts of the Mediterranean basin, regions that benefited from a much longer continuous history of dedicated paleoanthropological research and excavation funding. Central and Eastern Europe, by comparison, remained considerably less thoroughly studied, often treated as a kind of peripheral region in the broader narrative of Neanderthal history, important primarily as a transitional zone between better documented populations further west and the deep genetic reservoirs of Neanderthal ancestry believed to exist further east, toward the Caucasus and beyond. The Stajnia discovery directly challenges that long-standing assumption. According to the researchers themselves, this finding reinforces the idea that Central Eastern Europe was never simply a marginal periphery within the broader story of Neanderthal history, but instead represented a genuinely key region for understanding population movements, biological connections, and the spread of technological traditions throughout the Middle Paleolithic period. Stajnia Cave and the surrounding area of southern Poland are now being treated by researchers as what one team member specifically described as a privileged observatory, an unusually well-preserved window, allowing scientists to reconstruct not only the basic biology of the Neanderthals who lived there, but also the broader patterns of movement and connection linking different Neanderthal groups distributed across enormous stretches of the European continent. This shift in geographic emphasis matters considerably more than it might initially appear, because it suggests that decades of concentrated research attention focused primarily on Western European sites may have inadvertently created a somewhat skewed, incomplete picture of Neanderthal history as a whole, simply by virtue of where research funding, academic infrastructure, and sustained excavation efforts happened to concentrate over the past century. If a single cave in southern Poland can yield genetic evidence this significant, confirming an actual family relationship, and revealing genetic connections spanning well over 1,000 miles, it raises an obvious and genuinely exciting question about what additional evidence might still be waiting, completely undiscovered, Inside other, less thoroughly studied caves scattered across Central and Eastern Europe, sites that have simply never received the same sustained level of dedicated genetic research attention that Western European locations have benefited from for decades. Researchers involved in the Stajnia project have been notably direct about acknowledging just how unexpected these results turned out to be, even for scientists who had already worked extensively with this specific site for years. Two researchers from Polish institutions involved in the broader excavation project noted that they had known for some time that Stajnia Cave preserved exceptional evidence, given everything previously recovered from the site, but that these particular genetic results nonetheless exceeded their expectations considerably. They specifically emphasized that successfully identifying such an ancient, well-defined small group of Neanderthals within a site as geologically and archaeologically complex as Stajnia represents an important achievement, both specifically for Polish archaeological research, and more broadly for the entire ongoing study of Neanderthal populations across Europe. That acknowledgement of complexity deserves a moment of genuine appreciation, because the underlying technical achievement involved in this research is genuinely difficult to overstate. Successfully extracting usable ancient mitochondrial DNA from teeth that have spent 100,000 years buried inside a cave environment, subjected to constantly fluctuating temperature, humidity, and chemical conditions across that entire span, represents an extraordinarily delicate scientific process, one where a single contaminated sample or a single procedural misstep could easily corrupt or destroy results that took years of careful, methodical work to obtain. The fact that researchers successfully recovered usable genetic material from 8 separate teeth and were then able to confidently establish direct genetic relationships between several of those individuals reflects a genuinely remarkable convergence of advanced laboratory technique, rigorous statistical analysis, and an enormous amount of patient, careful work conducted across multiple research institutions spanning several different countries. Looking forward, this discovery opens up considerably more questions than it definitively answers, which is precisely the kind of outcome that tends to drive an entire research field toward its next major phase of active investigation. If this specific Neanderthal maternal lineage really was distributed as widely across Western Eurasia as the current genetic evidence suggests, researchers will now be actively searching for additional sites that might reveal exactly how that distribution actually happened. Did Neanderthal populations migrate across these vast distances in relatively rapid, large-scale movements, or did genetic material instead spread gradually over thousands of years through a slower, more incremental process involving periodic contact between neighboring groups, each connection extending the lineage's reach only slightly farther across the landscape than the previous generation had managed? Researchers will also undoubtedly continue investigating that strange, still unresolved genetic connection between the Stajnia family and the much later individual known as Thorin in France, since resolving that 50,000-year puzzle carries significant implications for how confidently scientists can date Neanderthal remains sitting at the outer edge of what current radiocarbon and genetic methods can reliably measure. Future advances in dating technology may eventually narrow that apparent gap considerably. Or, alternatively, future discoveries might instead confirm that Neanderthal maternal lineages really were capable of persisting, essentially unchanged across far longer timescales than researchers had previously assumed possible, a finding that would itself represent a significant and genuinely surprising addition to scientific understanding of how these populations actually functioned across deep time. What remains beyond dispute, regardless of how these specific remaining questions eventually resolve, is the simple, quietly profound fact at the center of this entire story. 100,000 years ago, inside a narrow limestone cave tucked into the hills of southern Poland, a Neanderthal mother lived alongside her own children, surviving together through circumstances modern science can only partially reconstruct, in a world entirely unrecognizable to anyone alive today. Their bones eventually disappeared back into the earth. Their settlement was abandoned and forgotten, and for 100,000 years afterward, every trace of their specific relationship to one another remained completely invisible, locked away inside 3 small fragments of preserved tooth enamel that nobody yet possessed the technology to properly read. And then, through nothing more than careful, patient modern science, that exact relationship was finally confirmed, pulled back out of total silence after an almost incomprehensible span of time, offering a small but genuinely moving glimpse into the deep emotional reality of lives lived so long ago that they sit at the absolute outer edge of what human science can currently reach. The cave is still there, sitting quietly in the Polish countryside, holding whatever additional evidence still remains buried within its remaining unexcavated sections. The broader genetic puzzle connecting this family to populations scattered across 1,000 miles of ancient Europe remains only partially solved, with researchers still actively working to understand exactly how that connection was maintained across such an enormous span of geography and time. And the strange 50,000-year echo linking this Polish family to a separate individual discovered in a French cave remains entirely unresolved, a genuine scientific mystery that current technology cannot yet definitively answer one way or the other. Somewhere in the ongoing work being conducted across multiple research institutions right now, scientists continue sifting through ancient genetic material, searching for the next piece of evidence that might finally explain how a single mother's genetic lineage, confirmed inside a small Polish cave, somehow found its way across an entire continent, surviving in some form for tens of thousands of years longer than anyone studying this question ever expected it to.